Hi and welcome to this NPTEL course entitled Feminist Writings, where we're looking at Donna Haraway's The Cyborg Manifesto. So we have already covered quite a few lectures on this text, and now in this particular lecture we'll look at some of the interesting mapping outs that she does in terms of looking at what is more relevant to the context of our times, and comparing that with some of the other forms of representation earlier, and how the cyborg obviously takes up current forms of appropriation, current forms of representation, postmodernist, almost post-humanist forms of representation. So what she says over here, and this should be on the screen, is that I argue for a politics rooted in claims about fundamental changes in the nature of class, race and gender in an emerging system of world order, analogous in its novelty and scope to that created by industrial capitalism. We are living through a movement from an organic industrial society to a polymorphous information system, from all work to all play, a deadly game. And if you notice the adjectives used over here, and these obviously are sort of symptomatic of what Haraway has been arguing throughout this essay, and that she's saying that we're moving away from an idea of organic industrialism, an organic industrial society, to a polymorphous activity, to an information system where the difference between organic and inorganic are not so clearly discernible anymore. And if you remember one of the previous lectures, we talked about how Haraway explored the three major paradigm shifts which sort of informed the emergence of the cyborg. And the paradigm shifts were, first of all, the man-animal paradigm shift, then the sort of man-animal together, organic and inorganic, and then lastly the physical and non-physical. So these binaries, these ontological differences, sort of increasingly blurring away in the postmodern times, where the cyborg is a major embodiment of. And now she's saying that she's arguing for a politics, a subversive political system, or politics of representation, where which will bring about changes in some of the fundamental ideas of race, class, and gender. So our Eurocentric, organic, humanist idea of race, class, and gender are giving way to sort of a post-humanist idea of embodiment, a post-human idea of identity, a post-human idea of representation and politics. And the word polymorphous is interesting over here, because polymorphous means, it's a mixture of opposites, it's a mixture of things which are combined in a very playful way. And the word play appears as a very political category over here. So she says that we are moving from all work to all play. Now, what play signifies in the context of this particular essay is interesting, because play is an activity that may or may not be productive. I'll say it again, play is an activity which may or may not be productive, and is a very complex relationship with productivity is what gives play a subversive quality. It may not end up producing anything, so it's not really a part of the industrial productive mechanism or the productive machinery of control and consumption. So play becomes a postmodern, post-structuralist activity. And that's something Haraway takes up and appropriates and uses as a very important example of a deadly game. So a deadly game over here, or play over here, becomes an act of subversion. And in that kind of an activity, what we see is clearly that we're moving away from a Fordist or Taylorist mode of sequential production, of control production, control consumption, to a more anarchic model of production, a more polymorphous idea of production, where the difference between the producer and the product is not really always mapped out clearly. So simultaneously, material and ideological, the dichotomies may be expressed in the following chart of transitions, from the comfortable old hierarchical dominations to the scary new networks I've called the informatics of domination. So again, if you look at the adjectives, scary new network. Why is it scary? Who is getting scared? Who is it meant to scare? Obviously, it's scary from a Eurocentric, humanist perspective, where production could be a controlled activity, a consumption could be a controlled activity, representation could be a controlled activity. Now, obviously, from that mode of controlled activity, we're moving away to a more anarchic, more playful, more ludic forms of production and consumption. So ludic obviously is playful. It comes from ludo, which means play. So, and then she's offering us a very interesting chart, a very interesting sort of map of how the shifts have taken place in different realms of existence, different realms of representation, from a pre-postmodern to postmodern times, and how the cyborg obviously belongs to the second realm, the sort of the more postmodern, post-humanist realm. And now on your screen we should see this idea is mapping out the Haraway office, and she's sort of clearing, she's sort of giving titles to two realms as well. The first title on the left is called the Organics of Domination. The second on your right is the Informatics of Domination. So we see that how, if you look at the two categories closely, we find what is quite palpable is that how the right-hand side, the right-hand column, is a more postmodern column, the column which accommodates a cyborg, the column which produces a cyborg, out of which the cyborg emerges as an activity, as an organism which is also inorganic in quality. So if we just take a few terms, so if we just spend some time and unpack the differences between some of the terms mentioned on, which feature on the screen. First of all, representation. So representation is now replaced by simulation. Now what's the difference between representation and simulation? Now the word representation, or the word mimesis for the matter, it has a degree of organic quality to it. It's almost always high art. It's almost always a human activity. It is an organic human investment in almost any act of representation. So there is a spontaneity, an organicity, a humanness in act of representation, which is what makes it sort of, which makes it fit into quite closely into this humanist order of things. Now compare and contrast that with simulation. The simulation, the very word simulation has an artificiality embedded in it. So this artificiality is something which is highlighted, foregrounded, and almost celebrated by post-modernism in a very interesting sense. So just continuing with that, we have bourgeois novel realism, or the bourgeois novel, as compared and contrasted with science fiction and postmodernism. And one of the key things about postmodernism, and this is something that all students of postmodernism, such as ourselves, we are aware of, and that is the entire idea of unreliability, the entire idea of inauthenticity, the entire idea of the unreliable narrator, the narrator which can trick you, the narrator who is uncertain, the narrator who is nervous, narcissistic, neurotic, nervous narrators of postmodernism. Now, there is a complete contrast ontologically as well as functionally with the idea of realism. Realism being this sort of great 19th century phenomena, great 19th century representational mechanism whereby reality is represented as a closed product, as a closed commodity in terms of the spatio-temporal quality. The realist narrator would contain a narrator, if there is an insert narrator at all, who knows exactly what happens in the minds of characters, who has a sense of beginning, middle, and end, who has a sense of the before, now, and after, which is a complete contrast to the unreliability of the postmodernist narrator, which doesn't really have any of these ideas, any of this knowledge. And that, ironically, makes postmodern unreliable narration the more authentic form of narration, because in real life, we are all living uncertain lives. We don't know what's happening now, we don't quite know what's going to happen in the future, and we don't quite completely know what happened in the past. So there's always an unreliability about the way we navigate with our lives in real life. So the postmodernist unreliable narration is ironically the more authentic form of representation compared to realism, which tricks you into believing that it is real, it is about real life, which actually it isn't. Now, the other categories that we can quickly take a look at is on the left, there's depth and integrity, which is compared and contrasted with surface and boundary, or maybe superficiality is a word that will help us understand what's happening here better. So depth or integrity is replaced by superficiality. Now, what is superficiality, and why is superficiality celebrated in postmodernism? This idea of depthlessness, why is that an important thing? Because it does away with any sense of the ontology of origin. So it does away with any other origin narrative. So if you take something as completely superficial or completely depthless in quality, what you're essentially saying is that it doesn't require any authentic origin narrative. It doesn't require any kernel at the center. So this sort of centerlessness becomes a big component of superficiality, which is obviously a very, very postmodern phenomena as well. So, and then we can move on again on your screen. We have perfection, which is again organic and spontaneous and sort of human in quality. Compare that with optimization, which has a machinic quality embedded in it. Reproduction is replaced by replication. Hygiene is replaced by stress management, which is the most important phenomena, most important medical phenomena in postmodern times, stress management. So these become very, very important categories. Racial chain of being is replaced by you know, neo-imperialism and United States humanism. And this is very, very interesting, and in a very tongue-in-cheek style, Haraway is obviously critiquing the neo-imperial construct. So the racial gender being was obviously a form of social Darwinism which was invested into imperialism, which is invested in the sense of the racial supremacy, the supremacy of the white man, to be precise. And that was that was the ideological backbone, that was the empirical, quote-unquote, epistemic backbone of imperialism, which presupposes the superiority of the white man. Now that racial gender being is now replaced by neo-imperialism and United States humanism. So the face of humanism has changed. Now it's more United States humanism. So, and then we have scientific management and home factory, family market, you know, is replaced by global factory, electronic, cottage industry, woman integrated circuit. So what we're looking at is the difference between the macro mode of production and the micro mode of production, where you know, a micro activity can be productive in a scale that was unimaginable before the postmodern times. Just a couple of more interesting parallels here and contrasts here. The public-private dichotomy is now replaced by cyborg citizenship. Now, what is cyborg citizenship? Now, this is an interesting bit that I want to spend a little bit of time with. Like most postmodernist essays, and even Haraway's essay, is quite prophetic in quality. So she's talking about cyborg citizenship in a time which did not really have drones as warriors for nations, but now drones as warriors for nations is very much a reality. So we're looking at a different kind of grammar of combat altogether. We're looking at a different mode of combat, a different grammar of combat, a different kind of combat, where we don't really require human beings anymore. So drones can do the war for you, drones can fight the war for you, drones can, you know, win the war for you. And, you know, these become very important qualities. You know, so we're looking at a future where citizenship for drones can actually become a reality, if it's already not a reality already. Because, you know, drones are fighting for countries. So we have two kinds of drones, so two different nations fighting with each other in battlegrounds, where, you know, the idea of citizenship, the idea of identity, the idea of ownership on the drones become very, very important. So we're looking at cyborg citizenship as a real phenomena. Okay, and then just finally, Freud is replaced by Lacan, which is obviously more distributed, more postmodern in quality. Mind is replaced by artificial intelligence. Again, the organicity of the mind, the purity, the pure human organic quality of the mind, which is very, very human, embedded in humanness, is replaced by artificial intelligence, which is more of a switch-on, switch-off mechanism of, you know, a binary circuit. World War II is replaced by Star Wars. Now, what is this kind of contrast? So World War II was a real war where real people fought and died, and there was massive human casualty. You know, but if you compare that with Star Wars, which is obviously you know, a fictional game, in a hyper-mimetic game, we're looking at the difference between you know, the real and the hyper-real. The Star Wars is not really a war, but at the same time, it's a war which is, you know, forms of entertainment which is consumed globally across the world. Labor is replaced by robotics. Robotics obviously is artificial in quality, automatic in quality, as compared to labor, which is more human in quality. Now, what Haraway is obviously underlining over here, as she goes on to say quite clearly, the objects on the right-hand side cannot be coded as natural. A realization that subverts naturalistic coding for the left-hand side as well. Now, when we say that the objects on the right, like for instance artificial intelligence, robotic, cyborg citizenship, Star Wars, these are not really natural organic objects. So once we realize this, then we begin to question the constructed quality of the organicity, even the left-hand objects. So we talk about, for instance, a great chain of being, which is a chain of racial supremacy, a chain of discourse which legitimizes racial supremacy. Now, that kind of discursive legitimacy is obviously as much an artificial thing as you know, any of the right-hand side objects over here. But that's what precisely the point is. So the objective quality, the object-like quality, the artificial quality of the right-hand side objects, just doesn't promote the artificiality of them, but at the same time it throws back and makes us aware of the artificiality of the objects on the left as well, which is supposedly human, which is supposedly organic in quality, which is supposedly natural in quality. But we see how, and this is something which we realize even when we read Bell Hooks' essay, Understanding Patriarchy, how naturalization and normativization are important categories, important functions of creating and promoting grand narratives. So any grand narrative needs to be naturalized and normativized. So it appears as a natural thing, it appears as an unartificial thing, as an organic thing. Once it appears as an organic thing, then you don't begin to question its textual, material, inorganic quality, and then you begin to consume it as some kind of a meta-discursive given. But that's the whole point of the right-hand side column, which will make you aware of how even the ones on the left-hand side are as artificial, perhaps more artificial, more dishonestly artificial than the ones on the right. Okay, so so this is some of the important categories that Haraway is highlighting. Now, and then she goes on to say what happens to something like kinship, what happens to something like family, what happens to something like being a relative in this kind of a world, in this kind of a setting. And then she says, and this should be on the screen, likewise for race, ideologies about human diversity have to be formulated in terms of frequencies or parameters like blood groups or intelligence scores. It is irrational to invoke concepts like primitive and civilized. For liberals and radicals, the search for integrated social systems gives way to a new practice called experimental ethnography, in which an organic object dissipates an attention to the play of writing. So the play of writing becomes an important category of way up. So writing as play, writing as not essentially productive, not necessarily productive. And this whole idea of approximating productivity is something which is very postmodern in quality. Writing as play, writing as subversive, writing as a ludic activity. That's something that Haraway is highlighting. At the level of ideology, we see translations of racism and colonialism into languages of development and underdevelopment, rates and constraints of modernization. Any objects or persons can be reasonably thought of in terms of disassembly and reassembly. No natural architectures constrain system design. The financial districts in old world cities, as well as export processing and free trade zones, proclaim this elementary fact of late capitalism. The entire universe of objects that can be known scientifically must be formulated as problems in communications engineering for the managers, or theories of the text for those who would resist. Both are cyborg semiology. So the whole idea of cyborg semiology becomes quite clear. So what is cyborg semiology? Cyborg semiology is just micro-activity through which writing becomes play, through which representation becomes play, through which classifications are resisted, through any kind of meta-classifications are resisted. And cyborg semiology is a different kind, an alternative mode of semiology, which produces an alternative order of meaning from the dominant order of meaning. So that's something that Haraway is highlighting and perhaps advocating in this point in the essay. So in that kind of a semiological system, integrity or sincerity of the Western self gives way to decision procedures and expert systems. So the whole idea of the self disappears. The whole idea of self is problematized in this kind of a discourse. So self as a organic, natural, meta-discursive given, which is authentic in quality, which is rational in quality, which is almost divine in quality. Rationality and divinity almost often equate with each other. Especially in Enlightenment logic. That kind of equation, that kind of an Enlightenment-centric or Eurocentric idea of self is completely done away with. And what we have instead, it gives way to decision procedures and expert systems. So the word system, the word procedure, again, they highlight the mechanistic, the automatic quality of the self-aware, the automatic quality of postmodern rationality. It's not really rationality in a Cartesian sense of I think, therefore I am, this sort of divine quality about reason, divine quality about this light bulb spark of reason which will make you human. That kind of an equation, that kind of a sequential semantic equation between rationality and divinity and humanity, that is done away with. And what we have instead is a focus on decision procedures and expert systems. Again, systems and procedures become important, especially because of the artificiality which is embedded in those narratives. Okay, so and what happens to the, if this is what happens to self, or the idea of the self, what happens to human beings in this context? What ought to happen to human beings in this context? So human beings, like any other component or subsystems, again, look at the way in which Haraway is equating humans as a subsystem. So that, in a way, deflates the entire glamour of humanism, deflates the entire glory of humanism as being a unique activity, as being a unique gift, a unique primate in this whole world. where everything else is secondary, everything else. This very anthropocentric idea of humanism, of humanness, is done away with, and what we have instead is a more distributive quality of humanism, a more distributive narrative, a more distributive perspective on humanism, which becomes more humble, more democratic, and more inclusive in quality, according to Haraway. So, the entire idea of human beings or humanness must be localized in a system architecture whose basic modes of operation are probabilistic, statistical, right? So probability and statistics become very important categories rather than some innate sense of metaphysical rationality for Haraway. So no objects, spaces, or bodies are sacred in themselves. Any component can be interfaced with any other, the proper standard, the proper code can be constructed for processing signals in a common language. Now, what is being said over here is that the entire idea, the entire ontology of sacrality, which is sometimes related to rationality, sometimes related to humanism, sometimes related to imagination, or this pure natural organic activities, that entire idea of sacrality is done away with. And what we have in its place is the local nature of knowledge, the local nature of intimacy, the local nature of interaction. And she says that essentially that anything can be interfaced with any other if the proper standard or the proper code can be constructed. So if you can have the proper code, the proper replicating code, anything can be not just replicated, not just interfaced, but contaminated. Now, contamination becomes a very important category in Haraway's thesis, because contamination or dilution or making something impure is a very important activity, very important subversive activity for Haraway, because that does away with the entire fantasy of purity. Pure imagination, pure body, pure self, pure rationality, pure civilization, pure language. So the entire fantasy of purity has been done away with. What we have instead is a culture of contamination, where contamination becomes a kind of a quasi-hygienic activity, because contamination can be redemptive in quality. It can actually give you a sense of real hygiene, hygiene of which comes out of entanglement, a hygiene which comes out of a mixture, a messiness, a mutability. So anything can be constructed, reconstructed for processing signals in a common language. Exchange in this world transcends the universal translation affected by capitalist markets that Marx analyzed so well. The privileged pathology affecting all kinds of components in this universe is stress. Now, interestingly, look at the alliterative oxymoron that Haraway is highlighting over here, the privileged pathology, which is stress, communications breakdown. The cyborg is not subject to Foucault's biopolitics. The cyborg simulates politics, a much more potent field of operations. Now, in the postmodern world, the privileged pathology is stress. Our communications breakdown. That's the most insidious pathology, the most dangerous pathology in the postmodern world, where systems break down, where this communication breakdown, and stress happens because of a kind of breakdown. So instead of looking at an organic ailment and something which affects you at a cellular, organic, tissue level, we have a more an important pathology here, which is the communications breakdown, which is a system breakdown, an artificial machinery breaking down into pieces. It can't communicate anymore. It can't convey messages anymore. Now, in this kind of a setting, the cyborg emerges as not something which is a subject of Foucault's biopolitics, because even biopolitics contains, a collusion between ideology, some kind of an organic ideology and a state as an organic entity, and they collude together to create this fantasy of biopolitics. But the cyborg is not subject to Foucault's biopolitics. The cyborg simulates politics. So again, this is not really a representation. This is an artificial mimicry, an artificial imitation of politics. So it's the artificiality of the mimicry, the artificiality of this mimetic process is something which is highlighted throughout the essay over here. It's not really human mimicry, it's not really human imitation, it's not really human imagination or imitation. It's mimicry at a machine level, it's mimicry at an automated level. That's something that Haraway is highlighting quite clearly and quite spectacularly. The cyborg simulates politics, a much more potent field of operations, right? So politics becomes a potent field of operations, the representational markers in politics, the identity markers in politics. These become very, very important categories in a postmodern world, and the cyborg is designed to simulate those kind of structures, simulate those kind of functions. And in that act of simulation lies the potential for subversion. So again, we have a very interesting equation between simulation and subversion, which is embodied by the cyborg. It's not really a representational and a wholly in an organic mimetic sense. It is simulated in quality. It simulates reality through a machinic process, through an artificial process. And the entire artificial machinery of the simulation is something which characterizes a cyborg quite clearly, and that's something Haraway is constantly highlighting. And this brings us back to the entire three leaky blurring of distinctions that Haraway talked about at the beginning of the essay. The entirety of the organic and the inorganic blurs away. The entirety of the physical and the non-physical, the tangible and non-tangible, blurs away. The map blurs away. The border blurs away quite immediately and quite dramatically. And the cyborg becomes a very important, or very interesting embodiment of that blurring of borderlines. So we'll stop at this point in this lecture today, and hopefully we'll wind up with this essay in the lectures to come. Thank you for your attention.